The water reaches his chest now. Not regular water, this thick brown soup that's been swallowing him inch by inch for the past 6 days. Paul Templar can't feel his legs anymore. They disappeared somewhere below the surface of this narrow pit, sucked into a grip so absolute that every tiny movement pulls him deeper. The jungle screams around him. Howler monkeys, insects, birds he can't name. But down here in this vertical shaft of earth and water, he exists in a tomb of mud. His arms shake as he holds himself against the walls. If he lets go, if his strength finally gives out, the quicksand will take the rest of him. Just 12 hours earlier, he thought he'd figured it out. He thought he was going to live. This isn't how Paul imagined he'd spend his 43rd birthday. Then again, nothing about the last week has gone according to plan. The expedition into the Peruvian Amazon was supposed to be straightforward. 2 weeks cataloging mineral deposits in an unmapped region near the Brazilian border. Paul had done this work for 15 years. He'd navigated swamps, crossed rivers, macheted through vegetation so dense it felt like swimming through green concrete. He knew how to read the jungle. He respected it. But the jungle doesn't care about respect. 8 days ago, Paul was walking along what appeared to be solid ground. The canopy overhead filtered sunlight into a green twilight. His boots squelched in the perpetual dampness, but that was normal. Everything in the Amazon is wet. The air itself feels like breathing through a warm, damp cloth. He was following a game trail. Animals know the safe paths, when the earth simply opened. No warning crack. No gradual sinking. One moment his right foot was planted on what looked like moss-covered ground. The next moment he was waist-deep in muck, dropping fast. His left leg kicked uselessly as his right leg got sucked down into something that felt like cold cement. He threw his arms out, and by pure luck, his left hand caught a twisted root jutting from the pit's edge. His backpack, loaded with 50 pounds of equipment, tried to drag him under. The pit was barely wider than his shoulders. A sinkhole, maybe 4 feet across, disguised by a mat of vegetation that had grown over it like a trap door. When he punched through, the mat collapsed behind him, and he found himself in a vertical shaft that dropped into darkness. How deep? He couldn't tell. Deep enough that his thrashing legs found no bottom. For the first hour, he thought he could climb out. The walls were earth and exposed roots. Surely he could find handholds. But quicksand isn't like regular mud. The mixture of sand, clay, and water creates something that behaves like a non-Newtonian fluid. When you move quickly, it solidifies. When you're still, it liquefies. Every attempt to yank his leg free made the grip tighter. Every time he tried to hoist himself up using the roots, his lower body sank deeper. By hour 3, he was chest deep, and panic was clawing at his throat with the same insistence as the quicksand clutched his legs. Paul forced himself to stop moving. That's what saved him in those first hours, the sudden clarity that struggle equals death. He'd read about quicksand as a kid, seen it in movies where it was always portrayed as some kind of dramatic death trap. The reality was worse because it was slower, patient. He wasn't going to suddenly sink under the surface and disappear. He was going to die by increments, exhausted, his body gradually accepting its fate. The route he'd grabbed initially had held, but his pack had to go. He shrugged out of it with movement so careful and deliberate he might have been defusing a bomb. The pack held everything: his GPS, satellite phone, tent, food, water purification tablets, first aid kit. Letting it go meant giving up his connection to rescue, to civilization, to survival. But the weight was pulling him down. He watched it sink into the brown water with a wet gulp. Gone in seconds. He still had his machete on his belt, his water bottle, a small knife in his pocket, and the root. That first night, the temperature dropped. Not by much. The Amazon doesn't get cold, but the combination of being stationary and chest deep in water made him shake so violently his teeth chattered like castanets. The sounds of the jungle at night are different than during the day. The insects get louder, their collective drone rising to a pitch that feels like it's inside your skull. Things moved in the darkness above him. He heard them rustling through the vegetation, occasionally peering over the edge of the pit. He couldn't see what they were, but he felt their eyes on him. The mosquitoes found him quickly. His face and arms became a feeding ground. He couldn't slap at them without risking his grip on the roots. So he endured. By dawn, his exposed skin was swollen with bites, his face puffy, one eye nearly swelled shut. But he was alive. The second day brought a new problem: thirst. He was surrounded by water, but drinking it meant inviting dysentery, giardia, a dozen other parasites that would turn his intestines into a battlefield. Still, by midday, with the sun turning the pit into a vertical oven and his tongue thick in his mouth, he began to reconsider. He scooped a handful of the brown water to his lips. It tasted like earth and decay. He spit it out, but later that afternoon, he drank. What choice did he have? Dehydration would kill him faster than parasites. His strategy for escape evolved slowly. The walls of the pit were earth, yes, but dense with roots, a chaotic network from the trees above. If he could use those roots like a ladder, pull himself up while somehow freeing his legs from the quicksand's grip, but every attempt ended the same way. The moment he put weight on a root and tried to lift himself, his lower body sank deeper. He was fighting physics itself. By day 3, the water had risen to his armpits. At first, he didn't understand why. Then he realized: rain. It had rained during the night, just a brief shower common in the Amazon, and the water drained into the pit. The quicksand was becoming more liquid, which meant less grip, but it also meant less stability. And if it kept raining, the pit would eventually fill completely. He would drown in quicksand. That's when Paul started talking to himself. Not rambling, deliberate conversation, as if someone else was in the pit with him. He narrated what he was doing. "Okay, Paul, we're going to try shifting left, see if that side has better root structure." He answered himself. Slowly. Don't jerk, let the quicksand adjust. It kept him sane. It kept him company. On day 4, he began to hallucinate. Dehydration, exhaustion, the infection spreading from his mosquito bites. His brain started misfiring. He had conversations with his ex-wife, arguments about the divorce that had happened 5 years earlier. She stood at the edge of the pit, arms crossed, shaking her head. "This is exactly like you," she said, "getting yourself stuck somewhere you can't get out of." He knew she wasn't real, but he argued with her anyway. The hunger was constant now, a gnawing emptiness that made his stomach feel like it was digesting itself. He'd gone without food for 4 days. He could survive weeks without food, theoretically, but not while expending energy trying to stay alive, not while his body fought infection and exposure. He began eyeing the insects that landed on his head and shoulders. Could he eat them? Would it help, or just make him sicker? He caught a beetle that crawled across his forearm, pinched it between his fingers, stared at it, put it in his mouth and chewed before he could think too hard about it. It tasted bitter and crunched in ways that made his skin crawl, but he swallowed it down. Over the next few hours, he ate 6 more insects. It didn't fill him, but it gave him something: protein, calories, psychological victory. Day 5 brought the rain again, harder this time. The water level rose 3 inches in an hour. Paul's chin now rested on the surface. He had to tilt his head back to keep his mouth and nose clear. The rain was also a gift. He could drink fresh water as it streamed down the pit walls, catching it in his mouth like a baby bird. It tasted like salvation. But the rising water also meant his time was running out in a new way. If the pit filled completely before he escaped, the manner of his death would change from slow starvation to relatively quick drowning. He wasn't sure which was worse. That night, with water lapping at his lower lip, Paul had an idea born of desperation. The quicksand held him because his legs were extended downward, presenting maximum surface area for the grip. But what if he could change his position? What if he could somehow tuck his legs, make himself smaller, reduce the suction? It would require getting his entire body underwater. The thought terrified him. If he miscalculated, if he couldn't hold his breath long enough, if the quicksand grabbed him differently once he was fully submerged, he'd be dead. But staying put meant certain death anyway. At least this was action. At least this was trying. He spent an hour psyching himself up, taking deep breaths, preparing. Then, gripping the roots with both hands, he dunked his head under the surface. The world became brown silence. The water was turbid, visibility 0. He couldn't see his own hands in front of his face. Moving by, feel alone, he tried to bring his knees up toward his chest. The quicksand resisted like it was alive, like it had intelligence and malice. His lungs started to burn, 30 seconds underwater, 45. He pulled harder, tucking, compressing his body. His knee broke free from the muck with a sensation like tearing Velcro. His other leg followed. For a moment he was floating in the pit, curled in a fetal position, held down only by the weight of water above him. Then his lungs gave out. He rocketed upward, gasping, breaking the surface with a cry that scattered birds from the trees overhead. He'd done it. His legs were free. But free to do what? He was still in the pit, still trapped. The difference was that now he was treading water instead of being held in place. It seemed like progress. It had to be progress. For several minutes he just floated there, getting his breath back, his heart hammering. Then he began to explore his new reality. With his legs free, he could kick, could use the roots on the walls to pull himself up. The pit walls were steep but not vertical, maybe 80 degrees. With the right technique, with enough strength, he started climbing. The roots were slippery, covered in algae and slime. His hands, weakened from days of gripping and malnutrition, could barely hold on. He got 3 feet up before his left hand slipped and he plunged back into the water with a splash. The quicksand at the bottom tried to grab him again, but he kicked away from it, keeping himself in the more liquid upper layer. He tried again, made it 4 feet this time before falling. Again, 5 feet. His palms were bleeding now, torn by the rough bark of roots. His arms trembled with fatigue, but he was making progress. Inch by inch, attempt by attempt, he was climbing. On his 9th try, he made it halfway up the pit, about 6 feet. He could see the rim, see the vegetation at the top, see daylight filtering through the canopy. Freedom was right there. He reached for the next root, wrapped his fingers around it, pulled. It snapped. The fall seemed to happen in slow motion. He twisted in the air, hit the water back first, went under completely. The quicksand was waiting. It grabbed his left leg immediately, yanking him down like a hand reaching up from hell. He screamed underwater, bubbles exploding from his mouth, and clawed his way back to the surface. When he broke into air again, sobbing with frustration and terror, he realized something had changed. The fall had injured him. His back, where he'd hit the water, felt wrong. A deep, radiating pain that suggested damaged muscles or ribs. Every breath hurt. His left ankle, caught briefly by the quicksand, throbbed with a sharp agony that made him think he'd broken it, or maybe just badly twisted it. Either way, climbing was now going to be exponentially harder. That was day 5. Day 6 began with fever. The infection from his mosquito bites had spread, or maybe it was from drinking the contaminated water, or maybe it was the insect protein disagreeing with his system. Whatever the cause, Paul woke, if you could call his fitful drifting in and out of consciousness sleep, with his body on fire. He shivered and sweated simultaneously. The pit spun around him. Delirium set in hard. He saw his father, dead now for a decade, standing at the rim of the pit. His father was a geologist, too. That's why Paul had gone into the field, following in the old man's footsteps. "You're not trying hard enough," his father said, disappointment heavy in his voice. Paul wanted to scream at the hallucination, wanted to tell his father to climb down here and try it himself, but his throat was too raw. The fever broke sometime in the afternoon of day 6, leaving him weak as a kitten but clearer-headed. He took inventory. His body was failing. He had maybe 2 days of strength left, possibly less. The water in the pit had receded slightly. No rain in the past 24 hours, but he was still chest deep. His back injury made it agony to reach for the upper roots. His ankle couldn't support weight, but he had to try again. This time, he strategized differently. Instead of trying to climb straight up, he would spiral, use roots on all sides of the pit, distribute the strain, take breaks every foot of elevation. It would be slower, but maybe more sustainable. He began at dusk when the heat was slightly less oppressive. Right hand to a root, pull, get feet against the wall, push, left hand to the next root, pull, shift weight, rest, breathe, repeat. The pain in his back was a living thing, sharp and vicious. His ankle screamed every time he put pressure on it. His arms felt like they were made of water. But he climbed. 1 foot, rest, 2 feet, rest, 3 feet. His vision tunneled. The edges went dark and all he could see was the next root, the next handhold. 4 feet, 5 feet. He was halfway up, the same point where he'd fallen before. The broken root still jutted from the wall like an accusation. He avoided it, chose a different path. 6 feet, 7 feet. The rim was so close now, 3 feet away, then 2. His right hand reached up, fingers stretching, and touched the vegetation at the top. Grabbed it. Living grass and vines and solid earth. He pulled with everything he had left, his feet scrabbling against the wall, his injured ankle a white-hot poker of pain. His head cleared the rim. He could see the forest floor, see the trees, see the world beyond the pit. One more pull, one more heave. His left hand joined his right, both gripping the edge. He hauled himself up, his torso emerging, his waist, his legs kicking. His right hand slipped. The vegetation he was holding, just a mat of shallow-rooted plants, tore free. For the second time, Paul fell. But this time, he'd been higher. This time, the fall was worse. He hit the water hard, went under, thrashed to the surface. The impact had knocked the wind out of him, and he gasped for air that wouldn't come. His lungs were frozen, his diaphragm spasming. For 10 seconds, an eternity, he couldn't breathe at all. His vision went sparkly at the edges. Then, finally, his lungs unlocked and he dragged in a ragged breath. He'd also bitten his tongue during the fall. Blood filled his mouth, mixing with the pit water. He spit it out, but more came. The coppery taste was overwhelming. And then the crushing realization. He couldn't do it. He wasn't strong enough. The pit was going to win. Paul spent the rest of day 6 and all of day 7 floating in the water, too exhausted and broken to attempt another climb. The fever returned. He drifted in and out of consciousness. At one point he realized he was singing. Childhood songs, nursery rhymes his mother had taught him. Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. His voice was a croak, barely human. He thought about dying a lot during those hours. Tried to make peace with it. He'd lived 43 years, seen some things, loved a few people, made some mistakes. It wasn't enough time, it's never enough. But maybe it was what he got. The universe didn't owe him more. But then, on day 8, with the sun barely risen and mist hanging over the pit like a shroud, Paul heard something that made his heart stop. Voices, human voices, distant but definitely real, speaking Spanish, which Paul understood enough to catch fragments. Tracks lead this way. Been missing 8 days now. Search pattern Delta. A search party, looking for him. Paul's throat was too damaged to scream. The sound that came out was a wheeze, a pathetic croak that wouldn't carry 10 feet, let alone the 100 or more yards to where the voices were. He tried again, putting everything into it, and managed something closer to a shout. Here! I'm here! But the words were slurred, weak. The voices moved away, fading. Number. No, no, no. Not like this. Not when rescue was so close. Paul grabbed a root and pulled himself up with strength he didn't know he still had. Adrenaline flooded his system, overriding pain, overriding exhaustion. He got his feet against the wall and climbed. 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet. He had to get high enough that his voice would carry, had to make them hear him. At 5 feet, he screamed, or tried to. What came out was animalistic, a roar of desperation that tore his throat. "Here! Help! I'm in a pit!" The voices stopped. Silence for a heartbeat. Then excited shouting. "Did you hear that? Over there!" Someone responded. Paul screamed again, and again. Each one left him weaker, but he couldn't stop. Had to keep them oriented. Had to guide them in. 2 minutes later, an eternity, a face appeared above the rim of the pit. A young man, maybe 25, with a radio in his hand and shock written all over his features. "Dios mío," he whispered. Then, louder into the radio. "We found him! We found him!" What happened next was a blur. More faces at the rim. A rope being lowered. Instructions shouted in Spanish and English. Paul could barely hold on to the rope, his hands too damaged, his strength too far gone. Someone had to climb down to him. A rescuer in a harness who clipped Paul into a safety line and held him as they were both hauled up. Breaking the surface of the pit felt like being born. Paul collapsed on solid ground, shaking, crying, unable to process that he was out, that he'd survived. The search team, 6 men from a local mining company, coordinated with Peruvian military, had been looking for him since day 3, when he'd missed his scheduled radio check-in. They'd found his base camp abandoned and started a grid search. The pit had been nearly impossible to locate, hidden under its mat of vegetation. If Paul hadn't made noise at exactly the right moment, they would have walked past. They gave him water, clean water, and he drank until he vomited. They wrapped him in emergency blankets even though it was 85 degrees. The medic with the group started an IV to combat dehydration and administered antibiotics. Paul's blood pressure was dangerously low. His core temperature was below normal despite the heat. His body was shutting down. Another day, the medic said later, maybe even another few hours, and he would have been past saving. The evacuation took 6 hours. They had to rig a stretcher and carry Paul through terrain that had no trails, no paths, nothing but jungle. He drifted in and out of consciousness during the journey. At one point, he woke to find them crossing a river, the stretcher balanced on a raft of lashed-together logs. The sky above was deeply blue, and for a moment, Paul forgot all about the pit, forgot the pain, and just marveled at being alive to see that color. They reached a clearing where a helicopter was waiting. The flight to the hospital in Iquitos took an hour. Paul remembers very little of it, just the thrum of rotors and the faces of the crew, their expressions mixing relief and concern. At the hospital, the damage became clear. Paul had lost 18 pounds from his already lean frame. The infection in his skin required aggressive antibiotic treatment. His back injury was severe muscle trauma, not a broken bone, but it would take months to heal. His ankle was fractured in 2 places. He had early-stage kidney failure from dehydration. The parasites from drinking contaminated water would require their own course of treatment. But he was alive. The psychological impact took longer to assess. For weeks after his rescue, Paul couldn't sleep without nightmares of sinking, of suffocation, of being trapped. He developed claustrophobia. Elevators, small rooms, even tight clothing would trigger panic attacks. The smell of wet earth, which had once been a normal part of his work, now made him nauseous. He spent 3 months in physical therapy, learning to walk properly again on his fractured ankle. The doctors said he'd always have a slight limp. The scars on his palms, from clutching the roots until his hands bled, would be permanent. Pale, raised lines that looked like he'd tried to grab onto barbed wire. Paul never went back to fieldwork in the Amazon. He took a desk job with his company, analyzing geological data that other people collected. Some might call that giving up. Paul called it survival. The jungle had taught him something valuable. There's no shame in knowing your limits. There's no weakness in admitting when something has broken you. But here's what surprised him. He didn't regret the experience. That sounds insane, even to him. 8 days in a pit that tried to kill him, that came within hours of succeeding, and somehow he looked back on it as meaningful, transformative even. In the pit, stripped of everything, technology, comfort, even the hope of rescue, Paul had found a core of himself he didn't know existed. Some animal place that refused to quit even when quitting made logical sense. He'd been forced to befriend his own mind, to talk himself through hell, to find reasons to keep trying when there were no reasons left. He'd also learned that he was smaller than he'd thought. Not metaphorically, literally. The universe was vast and powerful and completely indifferent to whether Paul Templar lived or died. The quicksand didn't hate him. The jungle wasn't malicious. He'd just been in the wrong place and nature had done what nature does. There was something weirdly comforting in that realization. It meant the world wasn't out to get him. It meant his suffering wasn't personal. A year after the rescue, Paul visited the site again. The company he worked for had to send another team to complete the mineral survey, and Paul hitched a ride on the helicopter, told them he needed to see the place one more time. They tried to talk him out of it, but he insisted. The pit was still there, of course, maybe even deeper now, after a year of rain and erosion. The vegetation had grown back over the opening, making it nearly invisible again. Standing at the edge, looking down into the brown water, Paul felt a strange sense of gratitude. This thing had tried to kill him and failed. He'd beaten it. He pulled a coin from his pocket, an American quarter, and dropped it into the pit. Heard the distant plop as it hit the water. An offering, maybe, or a middle finger, or both. Then he turned and walked away, his slight limp barely noticeable after a year of practice. These days, Paul tells the story at parties when people ask about the scars on his hands. He's gotten good at the telling, knows which details to include for maximum impact. The part about eating insects always gets reactions. The hallucination of his ex-wife usually gets laughs, but he always ends the same way, with the same observation that feels truer every time he says it. We're all in pits of one kind or another. Some are made of quicksand and rainwater. Others are made of debt or addiction or grief or bad relationships we can't escape. And when you're in the pit, when you're chest deep and sinking, the only thing that matters is whether you keep trying to climb. You'll fall, maybe many times. Your hands will bleed. Your body will fail. But you keep reaching for the next route, the next handhold, the next moment of survival. Because the alternative is sinking. And sinking means accepting that the pit wins, that wherever you're stuck becomes where you die. Paul didn't accept that. For 8 days, in a vertical prison in the Amazon, he refused to let the quicksand have him. He was saved ultimately by a search party and luck and timing. But he was alive to be saved because he never stopped fighting, even when fighting seemed pointless, even when his body and mind were broken, even when every logical calculation said he was already dead. The pit taught him that the human will to survive is its own kind of force, as real as gravity or time, and sometimes, if you're stubborn enough, if you refuse to quit even when quitting makes sense, that force is enough to keep you breathing until help arrives. Paul still has nightmares about the pit, probably always will, but he also has something else, the unshakable knowledge that he can endure more than he ever thought possible, that when everything was stripped away, comfort, hope, even the reasonable expectation of survival, there was still something inside him that refused to give up. That something is what makes us human. It's what makes us extraordinary. And it's what allowed Paul Templar to climb out of his vertical prison in the Amazon, 18 pounds lighter, broken in body, but somehow stronger in spirit than he'd ever been before. The pit didn't kill him. Instead, it taught him what he was made of, and that's a lesson worth surviving for.